to the University of Montana and the Blewett School of Law. A teach-in is a meeting usually held on a college campus for discussions to raise awareness of a social or political issue. The issue we're here to discuss is our politics and our roles in political divisions and our potential for a more perfect union. We are here, in other words, because we are here, where the quiet beauty of our state is riven by deep partisan divides. And we are here, where even a college campus literally pales in comparison to the deep blue neighborhoods where most of us live, and stand just 6 miles away from where the president is currently speaking, and the reverse is true. I've been fortunate in a very short amount of time to be able to convene a panel of the university's leading academic voices on this issue of partisanship and our political future together. Ramona to my left, is a political scientist who teaches and studies classical, modern, and contemporary political theory. Monte Mills, to her left, is a lawyer who studies and teaches Indian law and the role of lawyers in legal education in resolving differences. Tobin Shearer, to his left, is an historian who studies and teaches the history of race, religion, and the civil rights movement. To his left is Rooks, who is a sociologist who studies and teaches about labor and other social movements and collective action. I'm Johnstone. I'm a lawyer who studies and teaches constitutional law and the law of politics. We're going to each take 2 quick rounds on the causes and then some potential solutions to our partisan divide, and then we're going to open it up to a collective discussion with you. Where to start? The title "More Perfect" comes from the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. It refers to the displacement of the Articles of Confederation, of the displacements of the states in that role with the people as the sovereigns. What makes our union more perfect is that it comes from we the people, not from we the states, or separate polities in a confederation. Now, organizing that union of we the people was the framers' challenge in the Constitution. And that's a challenge because, as James Madison realized, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. We are not angels. People are flawed. People in politics are flawed. We've been so for a very long time, if that can give us any solace in this moment. And we're flawed in particular ways in the way that we form groups. Because before government, we had to cooperate to survive, and the best way to cooperate to survive was to make friends quickly and identify enemies even more quickly. And reward people for doing that. So we would be in in-groups and out-groups. And we would reward each other, and we would have collective rituals together. You can call them today rallies or protests to reinforce the in-group. And we would ensure and reward calling out enemies or out-groups. You can call that Facebook. Madison's solution to it was, he thought of this idea of groups as factions. His solution to it was to create a republican form of government, by which you just mean representative democracy. And he thought that what we could do by having representative democracy is that first, by delegating leadership up to our elected representatives, you wouldn't have to find so many people to govern, and you can ensure that the very best people would be running government. And you would also have an opportunity in this new nation to expand the sphere of government, expand the sphere of competing interests, so that it was there was no permanent alliances between people. They would simply argue for their interests, resolve the issue, have a majority vote, and then move on to the next issue. there was a huge blind spot in this, and they realized it pretty quickly. Credit to this goes to one of my con law students a few years ago. That's George Washington in the first panel. No parties. Well, pretty early on, this whole thing came apart because of the problem of faction. It is natural for people to form parties, to form factions, and they did. Now, for a long time, through our history, with some notable exceptions such as the Civil War, other interests, what we sometimes call sectionalism, this idea that regional interests would cross-cut partisan lines, tended to keep the partisanship from being weaponized under our constitutional system, except with rare exceptions. This persisted, even with mass media and other things raised the stakes for partisanship, bolstered for most of the 20th century by common enemies, which helps, right? We were all the in-group, and people outside were the out-group. But over time, with the relative peace and political realignment, disintermediation, social media, we realigned ideologically to the point where it's a relatively rare thing that everyone who's ideologically conservative are Republican and everyone who's ideologically liberal are Democrats. This is a graph from a recent book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukanoff, pulling together some Pew Research studies. What it shows is that even in 1994, that we had differences, but our differences based on party were no greater than our differences based on other sort of affinity groups we might have: race, religion, education, age, gender. That changed. There became an alignment where it wasn't, I am a Democrat because I believe I have these interests, I believe in these policies, or I am a Republican because I have these interests, I believe in these policies. It became, I am a Democrat so that I'm now in my in-group, so that I probably should believe in these policies, or I'm a Republican, so I probably should believe in these policies. It is deeply seated in, this is some more of Jonathan Haidt's work, but deeply seated in real moral differences, moral preferences of the parties, and that because they're deeply seated, they're quite easy to mobilize if the conditions are right. And unfortunately, the conditions are right when you have government set up this way. It's even worse. The better educated you are, this is some studies by my former professor Dan Kahan, the better educated you are, actually, and this is something Tobin might speak to, the harder core your beliefs may be on particular issues, so that more information, more facts, more science actually is likely to entrench those beliefs. And so we are now stuck in something like what I'd call Madison's nightmare, where we have a system that instead of refining and enlarging the public views through a system of representation in elections, we're really filtering candidates for partisan purity. And instead of enlarging the republic so we have a better mix of interests, what we're doing is enabling larger boxes into which we can sort ourselves that largely serve as echo chambers. In other words, I'll leave with that. Ramona?
Yes. Well, since I'm the political theorist, let me talk about ideas. And one of my favorite thinkers is George Orwell. And at the end of the 1930s, he said, and I'm quoting him, "We have now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of free men and women." So let me state some things about perhaps the obvious here. Today, we seem to be associating, I think, democratic unity with a like-minded community. Therefore, compromise is associated on the political left and right oftentimes with selling out, with compromising one's community or one's values. And that's because, again, compromise is considered at all times next to the devil. Compromise is always an expedient, never a moral or principled solution. And anyway, why compromise when you know you're right? Right? This poses a serious problem can democratic government function unless people are willing to compromise, say in Congress, or for that matter, any democratically organized political agency, unless participants are willing to give and take? The answer in practice, I think now, is no. That is, the process of governing functions only as long as the participants are willing to compromise, and where in the last analysis, the will of the majority is accepted as the will of everyone. No doubt for the minority to accept the will of the majority, the minority has to compromise, and if the majority expects its views to be acceptable, to the minority, it too must be prepared to compromise. We hope that both sides are willing to give something up and to reach a decision that's acceptable or at least livable to all parties. Well, why is compromise today so difficult? Well, one reason, I think, and by no means the only reason, is that we have a current politics, or politicizing, if you will, of fear, of insecurity. How can one compromise with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for and what you care about? It's not enough to say that Republicans and Democrats offer different views or different positions on policy, or even disagree on first principles. But according to our political leaders, our pundits, even fellow citizens, right, the other party, whatever the other party might be, they're in the business of destruction. So I don't think the problem is simply that we lack or no longer have a common culture. I'm not entirely sure we ever had one, or a common language. In fact, I think right now we do have a common language. It is the language of fear, of anger, of resentment, of powerlessness. Why don't they understand? We used to believe in a democratic process. We put ballots over bullets, but today votes are equated with acts of violence. Think about it. I heard one report say one senator's vote is putting people's lives at stake. Well, maybe, but if you frame it that way, there may be a price to be paid. All politics becomes very personal. That is, and on issues and questions that people regard as vital to their faith, vital to their interests, vital to their lives and livelihood, they will not compromise, nor will they allow their elected officials to do so. And in that case, the instinct perhaps of self-interest or perhaps self-preservation asserts itself and becomes dominant over social interests, or perhaps caring for our union. If groups refuse to compromise, the whole democratic process breaks down. And with it, of course, our ability for our government to get things done. So the question is, what do you do about this? The problem, I think, can't be ignored by a person committed to democratic principles. How to get people with sharply different viewpoints to come together and think about something called the public good, or the union. And so I want to close off my segment by noting something written by a fellow by the name of Thomas Paine at a time when our country was very divided. And he said this, he said, it's not in numbers, it's in our unity that our great strength lies. Unfortunately, I think as we come to the next election now, we are very obsessed with numbers and less with unity. I'll turn it over there. Yes.
Thanks, and thanks all for being here too. Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room is aware, in one way or another, of that. We are in a revolutionary situation, no matter how unpopular that word has become in this country. The society in which we live in is desperately menaced, not by Russians, but from within. To any citizen of this country who figures himself as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, you must be prepared to go for broke. Or, to put it another way, you must understand that in the attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty when it is operating not only in the classroom but in society, you will meet the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance. There's no point in pretending that this won't happen. Those are the words of James Baldwin, spoken almost 55 years ago to this day. And they seem quite prescient given our current times, and I went to this speech not to find that quote, but upon reading it, it seemed particularly appropriate for this evening, not just to remind us that our times have always been somewhat of struggle, but hopefully perhaps also to inspire, especially for those of us dealing with the young minds of young people. I went to this speech instead to find a different quote, because when I thought about divides, not necessarily partisan divides, but perhaps deeper divides that may be reflected in our partisanship, I thought of a different quote from James Baldwin, which is the following: "What passes for identity in America is a series of myths about one's heroic ancestors." And it occurred to me that in thinking about divides, and particularly a more perfect union formed by we the people, it might be worthwhile to revisit the fact that that union to begin with did not, in fact, include all of the people who were present on the continent. In fact, the indigenous people of this country had been engaged in governance on this continent for long before there were efforts to form a more perfect union. And those myths that we tell ourselves about our heroic ancestors and the way they inform our identities find particular sort of home, I suppose, in the legal system in which we've created ever since. And as an educator in the law school teaching the next generation of lawyers, I've begun to think a lot about what it is in terms of our role and responsibility to talk about the role and actions of the law and the legal system in perpetuating both the myths we tell ourselves about our heroic ancestors and the divides that those myths tend to lead to. And there are a few things, I think, about the legal system and the principles in which we aspire to uphold that tend to exacerbate those divides and further contribute to the myths and separation of identities. The first, of course, is the fact that I mentioned earlier. The Constitution itself, our more perfect union, while a striking achievement for humankind, as others have mentioned, has also been used for oppression and domination throughout its history. In fact, the system of law we have today is built in many ways upon those two competing principles, both the truths we held to be self-evident and the use of that legal system to oppress. But maybe even more nuanced and detailed than that is the way in which the legal system operates. And we can think about, for example, the concept of stare decisis, the reliance on prior precedent as a guide for future decisions. Not only does that help contribute to the rule of law and stability, but as the Supreme Court mentioned in a decision from 2006, it also ensures that we do not disrupt settled legal expectations. And that's especially true where a particular principle has become settled through iteration and reiteration over a long period of time. Instead, the law only departs from that settled precedent where there are exceptional circumstances. And so these myths, perhaps embedded in earlier decisions of our courts and our legal system, take on the force of law and become simply holdings, reduced to one or two sentences, maybe in a legal textbook, studied by generations of lawyers to come afterward. Then they lose the context in which they were rendered. No longer do we think about the broader implications, perhaps, of a finding that the United States, not indigenous people, actually owns ultimate title to all the property in the country. No longer do we think about the justification of that holding on racist terms and in racist language. So then the question becomes, what is our responsibility to address those long-held myths, that prior precedent? We simply cannot ignore the rule of law and the benefits it brings to our society. So what are these solutions? That's for round two.
Thank you again for joining us here this evening. It's a delight to be in a room with a group of thoughtful people. I want to talk for a moment about history and how that informs our discussion regarding our contemporary divisiveness. I'm going to reflect on two questions. The first of them is, who gets to decide what is true? At the advent of the academy, there was an extended and vociferous struggle over who got to decide what is true, with the church at that time having been the former purveyor of truth through the process of revelation. Something is true because the church said so. The academy comes along and makes the claim that truth is not a function of revelation, it's a function of experiment, logical argument, and through those processes, evidence. The struggle to determine that truth and answer the question of who gets to decide what is true has been an extended one that has been put in place primarily because when one begins to look at the question of relativity, as has obsessed much of the academy in the 20th and 21st century, those claims of truth that used to give so many people comfort because they were factual, simple, and safe, begin to change because what happens when so much can also be true simultaneously. And so we see in our contemporary society today those many fundamentalisms that are returning to offering simple, safe, determinative claims of truth, again based on revelation alone. And the atomization we've seen in society around fact is an atomization of who gets to determine what that truth is. Is it the press? Is it the academy? Is it those who try to create truth simply by saying that it's so? That's the first source of our divisiveness I'll identify, one that has deep and recurring historical roots. The second source I'll point to is who gets to decide how we will talk about the rudiments of race. Many have reflected on the resurgence of white supremacy that often gets tied to these notions of divisiveness and suggested that the reason they're present in society today is simply because we have talked too much about race. But I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons that white supremacy seems to be resurgent at this time is because we have not talked about it enough. We know that we didn't talk about it enough or find ways to deal with it adequately in the aftermath of the Civil War, in the aftermath of Reconstruction, when the KKK was reborn in Stone Mountain, Georgia in 1915. We didn't learn how to talk about it adequately during the Civil Rights Movement. We didn't learn how to talk about it adequately when President Clinton, in his 1996 initiative, tried to get the nation to do just that. And until we talk about that history of race, particularly the legacies of slavery and of Native genocide, as a nation, we will continue to see that recurrent pattern of resurgent white supremacy and all of the violence that we see present in society around it. As I was reflecting on those roots of divisiveness, I was reminded of the biblical passage that there's nothing new under the sun. And I think that's true, but I'll be so bold as to add a caveat to that verse and to say that there's nothing new under the sun, but we have new shadows with which we must contend. And I think our discussion of solutions is trying to figure out what to do with those shadows.
I've never been on a panel where everybody kept to their time. It's very exciting. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to uncharacteristically start with a tiny personal story. If you love stories, this is the only part of the talk that has a story. And if you hate them, it'll be over very soon. So I grew up Quaker and also punk. The former was very non-conflictual, although if my mother was here, she would claim, and I think there's some truth to this, that Quakers really know how to fight, but in a different way and much more quiet. Punk was very conflictual. There was lots of yelling. There were some physical fights. Often the root of the arguments were political, but sometimes quite mean-spirited and personal. And so in my early 20s, largely through college, I stumbled across the labor movement. And this provided me with a different window, a different way of thinking about and engaging in debate and disagreement. Neither of my parents were union members, and I'm sure that I knew people in my life growing up who were union members, but I wasn't aware of it. And what attracted me immediately to the labor movement was the high amount of debate and disagreement within unions. Within most unions, conflict is the norm, not an aberration. And the fact that debate and disagreement, while often very heated and often involving a lot of yelling, was carried out in a straightforward, no-nonsense way. This culture within many labor unions, not all but many, is the exact opposite of the culture of political debate and divisiveness that we have in our country today. So if we have a labor movement in the US that's well established, having existed since the early 1800s in the US, if not earlier, and very large, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2017, organized labor in the US represented 16.4 million people. And if this institution has a healthy culture of debate and conflict in our culture, why is it not exerting a larger influence on our political culture today? Well, one reason for that is the American labor movement has been in steep decline for the past 40 years. At the height of its size and influence in the post-war period, between 35 and 40% of all American workers were covered by collective bargaining agreements. Today, around 10% of all American workers are covered by collective bargaining, and that's about 35% of workers in the public sector and 6.5% of workers in the private sector are covered by collective bargaining. And those numbers, I think we will see the public sector numbers go down significantly in the next few years because of this recent Supreme Court decision. So why did this happen? It's not because American workers are not interested in unions or union representation, although that's a very common spin in the media. There's a tremendous amount of opinion polling of American workers that shows that given the opportunity tomorrow to join a union in your workplace, over half of Americans say yes, according to those opinion polls. But the decline of the American labor movement is the result of coordinated, effective effort of a range of anti-labor and pro-corporate interests. A lot of times people say pro-corporate, but they also are very solidly anti-labor. So we have large national organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturing, the Business Roundtable, and most notably and recently, the Koch brothers, working on a very coordinated effort over the past 40 years to weaken and in many cases dismantle unions. And I would argue to dismantle that culture of healthy, aggressive, constant debate and disagreement. Their most recent victory was this summer's Janus v. AFSCME Supreme Court ruling that dealt a serious blow to public sector workers and their unions. We can get into the details of that later or not, I don't mind. These groups have also poured millions and billions of dollars into media campaigns to foment skepticism and stigma, not only about working people's organizations, of which unions are one, not the only type, but one type of working people's organization, but really in many ways about working people themselves. So why does this matter, and what does it have to do with this topic that we're talking about today? Well, I would argue it matters for three reasons. The decline of unions in the US, not the disappearance, they still exist. We've got, I think, 7 unions that represent folks on this campus alone. The decline of unions in the US has meant that other groups with radically different interests have captured the interest and support of working class people. In our current moment, typically we think of that as right-wing populists and populism. The decline of unions has also meant that progressive working class voices, interests, and perspectives are more marginal in the political system than I would argue in any other period in the US since the Depression. And finally, and most relevant to this topic, I would say that the decline of unions in the US has meant that fewer and fewer Americans, a smaller percentage of Americans, oh, I'm so close, have experience with and have access to this culture of energetic, constant, healthy debate that exists within the American labor movement, and their experience of debate and disagreement is largely shaped by our political culture, which I would argue, and I think many of my panelists would agree, is the exact opposite of that. So then I'm done.
I can go.
Do you want to kick off solutions?
Sure.
Okay.
So what do we do about this?
I'll restart the clock. You're not going over.
Okay, good. like to have my own clock, too.
Steal my time. There are many solutions. We're going to hear about a number of them on this panel. I'm going to argue for one. I think that more unions, stronger unions, more progressive unions, and more broadly, more progressive working class organizations are a key to transforming our current political climate. And I say this acknowledging that organized labor in the US has rarely been radical, especially since the 1940s. But despite that, there are many blind spots around race and gender and immigration over the past decades in the US labor movement. But organized labor has been solidly critical of business, has been pro-consumer, and has been a strong pro-worker voice in the American political arena, a voice that is sorely needed in today's political climate. But stronger unions and more union members would also mean that more Americans would have access to this culture of debate and disagreement which exists in the organized labor movement, which I think is really quite healthy. And even if you were in a family where only one person was a union member, I would argue that that debate and that exposure to debate would trickle down throughout the other family members and people would have more access to this. Now, some in the audience might say that's fine, but that's really only going to benefit white men who work with their bodies doing manual labor. And that's really a common misconception about union members in the US. According again to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2017, although men are slightly more likely to be union members than women, among major racial and ethnic groups in the US, black workers have the highest union membership rate, a higher rate of unionization than workers that are white, Asian, or Hispanic. And some of the occupations with the highest unionization rates are pink-collar professions dominated by women. So protective service occupations are one of the highest unionization rates, security, police, corrections, those typically tend to be blue-collar professions. But education, training, and library occupations are one of the second largest groups of unionized workers in the US, solidly pink-collar occupations, and about 33.5% of workers in those occupations are unionized. So I would love to see more working class institutions, stronger working class institutions, more progressive working class institutions in the US, and I would especially like to see more of this in rural America. We have a strong tradition of unionization and working class mobilization in rural America, but that tradition is quite weak today, and I think it's creating and contributing to some of the problems that we see in our political climate. And I also just am an advocate for more mobilization, more protest, more mass protest that engages with working people's issues. So many of you probably heard this news about Amazon raising its minimum wage to $15 an hour. You know, there's some problems with it. It's not a total victory. Those workers are not unionized, but that movement, that decision that they made was really a response to this movement that's been going on for 5 to 10 years called the Fight for 15 movement. It's not a union movement, but it's a working people's movement to try to fight for a $15 minimum wage. We saw these massive Red for Ed protests last year, teachers and classified workers in the school systems across the US engaging in massive, sometimes quite militant protests. And it emerged in some interesting places that are not considered union strongholds, although these workers, many of them were union. Oklahoma, Arizona, West Virginia, just to name 3, were huge areas where tens of thousands of teachers and support staff mobilized. And we've seen other kinds of mobilizations in the past years that have not been framed as union mobilizations, but were carried out by workers who were entirely unionized. And so here I'm thinking about the Take a Knee movement, the NFL player protest against police brutality and racial discrimination were in a certain sense union actions. All NFL players are union members. And so I think we see some tremendous potential, and I think there's a very healthy culture that exists around debate. I'm not saying all of the culture of organized labor is healthy, but this culture of debate, I think we've seen some movement in this area, and I would argue that there should be more in more places and more of rural America, and I think we would see some really positive impacts on our political climate here in the US.
I'm going to discuss the answer to my own question of how indeed we end up needing to contend with our new shadows. I'll reference here two reckonings and two kinds of courage. The first reckoning comes from the problems as I described them earlier, and that I think we need to recognize and come to terms with the fact that we all need truth and desire truth around which to order our lives. That's a human impulse. But in the midst of that desire, I think we need to collectively reaffirm to each other that the truths that we claim need to be grounded in evidence. The second reckoning that I'll offer, again, has to do with the topic of race. Given that we have so often failed to get beyond the rudiments of race, collectively as a country, I think at this particular moment we need to start by recognizing that regardless of our racial identities, many of us are feeling fearful and alienated in an economy that leaves so many people with unstable forms of employment. But at the same time, I think we're going to have to listen very carefully to the voices of the leaders of those communities of color who have already been getting beyond the rudiments of race for generations. That's where that leadership will finally help us get to a deeper conversation that breaks the cycle of recurring white supremacy. Those are the two reckonings I'll suggest. And I'll also suggest two kinds of courage. The first is a collective courage to get behind the scenes where the uncomfortable and unpopular conversations happen, but yet have such an incredible impact on making forward movement. During the Civil Rights Movement, the resolution of the 1963 campaign to end segregation in Birmingham was as much a function of the street action as it was the behind-the-scenes negotiations that people like Vincent and Rosemary Harding, people I've written and studied about, engaged with at their own personal risk. Not only because they, as African Americans, were going into rooms where people literally wanted them dead, but they were doing it in places where they would be called race traitors for having done so. But yet it was their courageous conversations that brought divisive lines together and made that city, in the end, choose the path of integration. The second kind of courage that I'd offer, again, comes from the work of Vincent Harding. And here I call this a courage to engage in an ethic of hope. I had a student write me this week in advance of the events anticipating our community here in Missoula, and saying that she felt tempted to give into a sense of utter hopelessness. And I wrote back to her reminding the quote from Vincent Harding when he described the kind of hope he wanted to engage in was not the easy, placid, feel-good optimism, but rather, and here I quote him directly, a rugged, blood-stained hope born of the dark womb beauty of struggles for the creative transformation of ordinary women, men, and children who refuse to give up their extraordinary dreams of new beginnings in Alabama, Mississippi, Soweto, Georgia, Oakland, Prague, Greensboro, Beijing, Chicago, Philadelphia, Berlin, Detroit, in every place where humans live to nurture and embody their dreams. As we look at a country that is, some of us would suggest, on the precipice of fascism, I think we cannot afford to give up that very kind of hope that demands the ability to envision a future which is not yet with us, but can be.
So what do we do? From my perspective, perhaps two solutions, one somewhat large, one quite small. And in many ways, they track, I think, the much more eloquent and better thought through solutions Tobin has offered. On the broader scale, given our history and facts and evidence marshaled to support those facts, I think we need to hear more indigenous voices in this conversation. We have seen the changes that those voices have brought to our national consciousness, particularly in the last few years at Standing Rock and elsewhere. And it seems to me that if we are to better understand our system of governance, our society, our commitments to certain undeniable ideals of fairness and equality, then we should be best served by listening to people who have been similarly oppressed for the entire existence of that government. In addition, it seems to me, those voices are not just voices of education, but voices of survival, resilience, and perhaps hope. Because after centuries of oppression, they remain not just present, but viable sovereigns, governments ruling their own people and territory long after these centuries. At a smaller scale, a much smaller scale, in fact, the scale of this room, in a law school classroom, what can be done? It seems to me particularly relevant, not to use a legal term, for those of us educating the next generation of attorneys working in this legal system, to train them not only in the marshaling of evidence and the preparation of adequate briefs and foolproof legal arguments to win their case, but to begin to perhaps reject the traditional ways that that education has been done. For too long, I think, the law, particularly in traditional legal education, has been viewed as objective, almost scientific, in pursuit ever of justice. In many ways, the law professor has been seen as sort of this detached expert, simply divining these brilliant concepts, perhaps from thin air, and then downloading them, or more appropriately, tricking his or her students into understanding them through use of the Socratic method. That simply reinforces the long-standing practices of stare decisis and the insulation of the real meaning, the real truths, the real context of prior decisions of our courts and the imposition of oppression through our legal system. And so how do we begin to push back on that while ensuring that our students are still well prepared and still able to respect and understand and enforce the rule of law to take advantage of our legal system? After all, upon their successful graduation and completion of the bar exam, yes, successful, it will happen, they take an oath to uphold the United States Constitution and the laws of the country. They simply cannot be revolutionary in the sense of throwing bombs. And yet, they can and do and will change that system for the better if they have the right tools. And so, rather than rely on traditional methods of legal education for the next generation of lawyers, perhaps we can begin to connect other ways of education to what has always been the staid, tried and true method of training lawyers. Rather than simply focus on law as a unitary discipline, some would argue the highest discipline, we need to engage across disciplines to make sure our lawyers are trained not only in the arts of legal education, but in history and sociology and political science and biology and the natural sciences, to understand the broader context of the arguments and the decisions that they will make. That context to the law brings not only additional meaning, making better attorneys in the future, but hopefully rendering better outcomes for them as well. And in that sense, we might even rethink the nature of the law as an adversarial system, ultimately creating more division in our society because there is only one winner, one loser. But lawyers, given the tools that they are trained to use, have a wide range of abilities to change the world, not just in the courtroom. With that, on to more solutions.
Well, let me talk about something that I've been thinking about, and I think a lot of times I learn as much from my students as they learn from me, and in their responses to me on things. And one of the things that often comes up in my classes is this notion of democratic unity, and what does it mean? And let me suggest that it's possible perhaps under one of three conditions, which I've explored with my students. First, either the members of a democratic polity share uniform beliefs about fundamental issues, therefore eliminating any need to compromise since consensus exists. All of us agree on what is a just society, and we also agree on how to get there. That's very utopic, right? Probably not going to happen. Well, another alternative, second alternative, if there's disagreement on issues which people are unwilling to compromise, then those questions about which people feel so strongly about ought to be excluded from the democratic process. Here, the key to democratic unity is not so much an agreement on fundamental values, but an agreement to remove from the political arena and discourse those issues which there's fundamental disagreement. So fundamental that people would rather break heads than count heads. If a majority attempts to settle these questions about which the minority refuses to compromise, the democratic process again breaks down. So maybe it's more important, I've heard, to hold off voting. Hold off voting on which you have an essentially non-votable question, if you can save the political system. This, of course, again, assumes a consensus, namely a willingness on the part of all members of the society to agree to disagree, for the alternative may well be the eventual disintegration of our democratic political system. Now, the second solution sounds good in theory, but you know, it's never really worked, okay? We disagree, and we've tried to maybe withhold some issues from the political arena, right? But you know, what we end up doing is we split. We disagree, we go off into our own churches, our own neighborhoods, our own families, and we, again, silo ourselves into our own social circles. And I think what we end up doing is we either end up having a cold civil war or a hot civil war, which we've had. So, a third possibility. Third possibility for democratic unity, one which I think we're left with, is here there's a willingness on the part of all members of the polity to hold their respective political views open, just a little bit, open to some debate. No single truth is by definition true, though we acknowledge that truth is important to us, okay? No denying that. But no single interest is by definition unanimously legitimate. And that is the best we can say, is that I'm inclined to think that under these present circumstances, this law, this public policy is probably best, but I might be wrong. So I'm open to hearing the other side. This presupposes something that late great actor, his name was Peter Ustinov, once said. I think it was in one of his films, it was the Orient Express, perhaps that. Anyway, this presupposes something he says in that film. He says, in our beliefs, we are divided. In our doubts, we are united. So because of our doubts, we can remain, if you will, open to considering the other side. Also, by the way, I think a curious people tend to be a tolerant people when they want to know that other side. So in any event, there's room here for compromise, to put our disputes up for a vote and to live with a decision, even if it's contrary to your interests and mine. So I'm going to offer maybe two simple steps, solutions to creating more unity, and maybe they're too simple and they're challenging. First step, I think, is somehow we need, as a people, we need to find a way to live together and disagree. I think we need to do that. That's the first step, is we need to figure out a way to live together and disagree. The second step is where in those areas of life can we accommodate each other? Now, unfortunately, I think we're still a very long way from that first step. But I'm hopeful, not in a hopefully airy-fairy way, that we can get there. But it may take some time.
These are the toughest acts I've ever had to follow in this game. Look, the problem here is that we're talking about the system, as good academics do, as if we're outside of it, but we're in it. We are in a system, and we're actually, with some marginal changes, it's important changes, the 14th Amendment, some others, but we're in it. And if all it took was for a majority of Americans to go to the polls and change that, well, that's not our system, if you haven't already noticed. Partly due to the Electoral College. One of the things where I, in thinking about solutions, look to is the Electoral College, for all of its faults and its partly evil origins and perpetuating slavery. One insight it had was that the electors should meet in their states. That if we are going to pick our leaders, we are going to meet in small groups. It is going to be a small group exercise with our fellow countrymen and women. And by countrymen and women, we're thinking in the way that the founding generation thought about our country, meaning Montana is our country, right? Missoula may be our country, Virginia may be our country. At the local level, I think one way out of this Madison's nightmare is to simply turn his system upside down and start with the locals, start rediscovering those interests that we share in common because we live together. It's certainly true in law school, and it's hard to avoid just generally teaching the world at a national or international level because it's cheaper and easier that way. You can cover more subjects that way. We've got students who are coming from all over and going to all over. But it's, as I remind my students constantly, 90% of the law is right here in Montana, law that you are accountable for, that you have control over. That's where the action is locally. And so I guess I would suggest one way out of this nationalized politics in a structure where, look, it's going to be very hard to get anything more than marginal leverage at the national level, is to look to your neighbors and begin to identify those local interests you have in common. Of course, part of it is getting our elected officials and our leaders to do that. Of course, our leaders are really just following us, and there are some various mechanisms that make that harder. For example, most of our national leaders need to spend so much time paying tribute to their national interest groups, national donors, national independent expenditure groups, etc., that they don't really have much time to spend with us, and then it becomes pretty easy to forget that commonality of local interests that you actually have. You're spending so much time flying around on a plane raising money from people elsewhere. You're unlikely to actually know what your own voters want. And so there might be a few tricks we can get to so that our leaders are better able to follow us at the local level rather than at the national level. And one of them might be, and this is only because it's my hobby horse in my other field of election law, is looking at some campaign finance mechanisms. I often say I don't think the problem is too much money in politics. We don't spend as much money in politics in Montana as we spend on sporting events, and we don't have any professional sporting teams here. The problem is whose money in politics. I don't think we're getting much of a return on politics if even in Montana at a midterm we'll be lucky if about half of us who can vote do. So one way might be to get more of our money in politics through public funding, through vouchers, plans, and other things. And actually, this is something that has succeeded more often than not at the local level in various places across the country. Beyond that, though, again, our leaders are really just following us. And so outside of politics, a part of it is just simply us, I think, as Monty said, at a very local level, is looking around and understanding we have common interests. And as Montanans, as Missoulians, as members of this campus community, we have much more in common, and and it's very easy to forget it. And so small steps we can take to remind ourselves of our common interests and our common aims together could make a big difference over time. So I would suggest solidarity at the local level rather than taking sides at the national level. With that, and with deep thanks to our interpreters, thank you so much. Turn it over to the panel for any follow-ups. No? Solutions, problems. We'll like solutions better, but problems are okay too. That helps. Yes.
I just wanted somebody to help me. In civics class, I always learned that we have three equal branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. And I don't see that anymore. I see a legislative branch that can't legislate, and an executive branch that creates their own laws, and then a judicial branch which I'm not sure where they are anymore on that spectrum. So, I mean, how do we get back to, or was it ever meant to be, three equal branches of government?
I'll just jump in by saying I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but Montana's is working pretty well. Missoula's is working pretty well. Professor
That
Mills.
isn't what I'm talking
Right. I think that's why the solution is not to expect much from them I mean, they are following our lead. We are a divided country, and these old structures that James Madison and the founding generation put in place are working as they were intended to. And so there's nothing going on there, but don't get frustrated. Realize that most of the action is not in Washington, D.C. And I think that's part of the problem. We just think that that's where the right answers are. That Washington, D.C. is where our answers are, whichever side. They will follow our lead. I don't think we can begin to recover ourselves in a position where we can lead them to the right place unless we start to rebuild solidarity at a more local level.
I appreciate the hope.
There's a hand over here.
Yes, South Africa has the Truth and Reconciliation Act. I know there has been some conversation in the United States about implementing or trying to pass something along those lines. Also, what do you see in terms of the formation of an actual third party along the lines of what was discussed at the start of your conversation here, a real viable third party in this country?
Truth and Reconciliation.
Yeah, just in terms of, well, as has been mentioned, I think there's a much greater need for more truth and more reconciliation. Whether that takes the form as in South Africa for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or some of the efforts north of the border in Canada to address prior wrongs done by the Canadian government to Indigenous people, I think that remains to be seen. Ultimately, in my view, as I think you've heard from others on the panel as well, the forum for engaging in those types of discussions has to be effective and the right way to do it. And it doesn't seem to me that, particularly given the complications of legislation at the national front, that that's the right forum to start having those discussions about truth and reconciliation, at least at a formal level. Beyond that, I think, in what little I know about what has happened in South Africa, I think down the road there are further complications then about either land return or other questions that come out of that process. And so without, I think, careful thought about forum and how that process begins, it could eventually result in additional complications. So yes, the concept of truth and reconciliation, I think, serves many of these interests in terms of furthering this discussion. I think the question is how that happens.
Ramona can correct me, but there aren't, one law I recall from political science is called Duverger's law. And what it suggests is that as long as we have a system of first past the post elections, which Congress is in charge of and adopted in the early 19th century, of course we can do it differently in Missoula or Montana, but at the federal level, as long as we have first past the post elections, it's highly unlikely that we will end up with a third party. Just because of the way that it runs. So you'd need to look at other sorts of electoral reform even to create those conditions. Instant runoff voting is one of them. But as long as we have the current system, don't expect a third party to emerge. One might displace another, but it's rigged in such a way, and I use that word advisedly, that we'll probably have two parties as long as we have the current electoral system.
Also, just say with third parties too, is that when they do appear, either one major party will co-opt them because they know they'll take away votes. So if you get a third party that's a right party, well, Democrats are actually going to co-opt that because they know that'll siphon off Republican votes and vice versa. So they tend to get to be pawns oftentimes in our two-party system, unfortunately.
I want to raise an issue that has kind of been beating around in my head, and it's the presumption of the two-party system. Parties are not mentioned once in the U.S. Constitution, not at all. And there is a trapdoor in the Constitution where each house is directed to create its own rules for its conduct of business. And it seems to me that that provision in the Constitution has literally calcified the control of parties in the nation, because they are the ones that make the rules, that make the legislation happen, go ahead or not go ahead. And it seems to me that that's a problem that I don't hear very many people talking about. We have this presumption of parties, and yet they were, by our founders, factions. Your cartoon spoke that directly. They will divide us. They will destroy our nation. And we're not having them called into question. And I'm just wondering about that, if there's any thoughts about
that. It's a bit ironic, right? Because yes, Madison refers to them as factions, a part of that. They didn't particularly like them, but yet Madison is going to form a political party, right? So I think at the get-go, there has been, right? There's different divisions over these issues, over the adoption of the Constitution. We begin to see parties forming. And one of the things too, when you have a large legislative body, it has been a way to organize people to get things done, et cetera. Now, though, fortunately, it's created this real polar division, so it's getting counterproductive.
And again, if you're looking to diversify the parties, look to the states. I grew up in a state, first place I voted when I was 18, and my choices were the Democrat Farm Labor Party and the Independent Republican Party of Minnesota. New York has multiple third parties that run on fusion ballots. So don't take who shows up in Washington, D.C. every couple of years as the truth and the constraint here. There's lots of opportunity. There are lots of localities that, I think not too far back, representing democratic socialists and others, right? So that happens sometimes.
Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to mention, having read a little history of Washington and the way the government got started. Originally, when you voted for a president, you had two men running. The man with the highest votes was president. The man with the second highest votes was vice president. That didn't work more than one term because people aren't perfect. And the president finds his vice president is stabbing him in the back all the time. And then they had to change that almost immediately. And so we started with a flawed problem. And you end up with two parties because now you said you pick your vice president and the other party stands aside. And we started there. So what do we do now?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. you-
So you were mentioning, right, that don't mind so much who shows up every couple of years in Washington. I think it's more so who keeps showing up in Washington. And what I'm leading into is my question, how do you see term limits fitting into this? It appears to me it's a highly entrenched system, with highly entrenched interests. And when I look at how politicians act, I see a distinct difference once they have decided to retire, in terms of how they act, in terms of how they perform themselves, how they vote. And it would appear to me that that would be such a, it's not a small knob, and I don't know how you would ever get to it, right? Because it's a self-interest to keep the system that way. But if we could achieve that, I could imagine that that could have a substantial impact on an even short-term change on our political landscape. How do you see that fitting into this question?
We have term limits in Montana, and I don't think there are a lot of people who study the Montana legislature to think that it's solved any of those problems. Because what you have is you no longer have the institutional authority of longtime senior people, entrenched as they may be. Instead, you don't have really any weight in the institution at all. So what happens is that the parties are kind of in full control, and the parties show up and run the show each time and increase the partisanship of the session. Although it's likely that I was just looking back at this case, the US Supreme Court said that federal term limits were unconstitutional, but that was a 5-4 decision, and I bet with President Trump's appointees, they would be willing to revisit it. There might be 5 votes to uphold term limits now, if it were a good idea.
We've got a student who wants to get in the white. Andrea?
Oh, so I guess I was wondering, a lot of your solutions pointed to localities and community. With the power of gerrymandering in the United States and the trends of disenfranchisement that is reducing participation at the local level, how do you see that moving forward?
Well, I'll jump in with my lawyers ready to correct me beside me, I'm sure.
Sociologists are available to correct you also.
And my political scientists and sociologists will do so, we believe, in that matter. When the 15th Amendment was put in place, one of the comments made as it readily became apparent that the African American community was being disenfranchised even as they got the franchise was that that amendment had made a statement about who got to vote, but not how the voters were created. And that question was a question that our country tried to resolve with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which has now been undermined, and we're seeing that threat to one of the 3 things I think are fundamental in this country for really getting to those fundamental issues of race. One is citizenship, one is the vote, and the other is land. And your question gets to this, to that's one of those 3 central points, is that I think we have to have conversations. When I'm in workshops and I have an angry person in the room who's challenging what I'm doing, my first appeal is to simply to say to them, I'm pretty sure you value democracy. How can we ensure that that is in fact is universally applied in this country? And we need to invite people to that conversation as a way of getting at questions of voter disenfranchisement. And no one corrected me so far.
It's later.
Later, it'll come later.
It's worth bearing in mind that gerrymandering is less a problem in Montana because under our Constitution we have a nonpartisan, bipartisan redistricting commission, both at the state and, should we ever get a second seat, federal again. Federal, well, pretty hard to gerrymander when you've just got 2 seats and a mountain range in the middle. And by the way, unlike in the federal constitution, as Montanans, we do have a constitutional right to vote. There's no federal constitutional right to vote. There are federal constrictions on whether you can discriminate in the vote. But it sounds like a broken record. But you know, we have the tools available in Montana if we're able to recognize them. States can be the solution here.
There's another student over here. Go ahead.
Well, I first off want to say thank you for doing this because I feel like I've probably learned more and taken more time out of my day to go to events like this than maybe go to class. I've honestly been impressed by the solutions. I wasn't really coming in this expecting there to be solutions because sometimes I'm a little off-put by that, thinking, boy, how does this person think they can come up with a solution? But I was surprised by every single one of them because I really agree with all of them. I was on board with them. In the interest of me taking over the room and talking about each one of them, I think the courage to talk behind lines, I think is probably the one that I take to heart the most, and I'm trying to do myself. But my question and concern is probably more pointed at you, Professor Johnstone, as far as the leaders taking our lead. So my concern with that is that how do we strike a balance between looking to our elected representatives for leadership in times and in decision makings, but then also our elected leaders looking to us for guidance. And I think about that in terms of our way of communicating our interests to them lies in majority decision votes sometimes, and then I think in some ways minorities can be neglected in that way. And so I think it's something I'm trying to figure out myself, but how do we strike a balance between looking to our elected leaders for guidance, leadership, decisions, and executions, but then also for them pivoting and turning back to us and looking for guidance as well? How do we sort of navigate that balance?
I think this is a collective action question for our sociologists. How do social movements get our leaders to follow us?
Well, I think you could do it in a number of ways. If you sort of look at the history of social movements in the US, you could make a credible threat. You could make somebody's life hell. And I think there's a lot of examples of that in the recent Kavanaugh issue, of people really choosing the tactic of, I'm going to follow these decision makers around and shout at them to try to make my voice heard, because there are no other venues to do that. I'm not saying it's the most effective, but we saw a lot of that in the past few weeks. And you can also offer things in exchange for other things. And I think social movements in the US have pursued a lot of those three avenues more in different time periods than others. I think that, this is not really related to your question, but I'm going to loop back to my own point. I think the teacher strikes that happened last year were an interesting example of the first, of making a credible threat. We're not going to come to work until you address the serious funding problems in public education in this state. And it worked. Not across the board, not for everybody. They didn't get all their demands met, but they made some significant movement, at least in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona. And the credible threat was, there will be no schools until you address this issue. And what was surprising to me was how sympathetic parents were in a lot of those situations. Like the rhetoric, especially around unions in this country, is, oh, these are people that are demanding things, and and it was amazing to hear all the parents say, look, this is a real pain in the butt for us. And we want our school system to be funded, and we understand that this is the mechanism to make that happen. So, I don't know, that's just sort of a quick and dirty way to think about mobilization as a way to make your voice heard and make people do what you want them to do.
Another example that everybody knows about is Standing Rock, right? I mean, it started with a few tribal members concerned about their cultural beliefs and the impact of a potential development, and evolved into thousands of people gathering for a variety of different reasons, from climate change to fossil fuel reliance to whatever brought them forward to come together. But it was that collective action, that unity, and just the simple fact of beginning that process that ended up uniting that group. Ultimately, of course, there's a pipeline under the river, but it did make change. I mean, it was a process of delay, and it changed the course of how that decision process went forward. And the elected leaders, the President of the United States, issued a decision that was different because of that movement. Now, long-term, it's also resulted in additional work on the necessity and the sufficiency of tribal consultation, so it may still have long-term effects despite that one decision. But I think that's another example, not just of one particular group of teachers, but sort of a collective of interest groups uniting around one particular event and bringing together the full force of a united front.
And way back here.
So in undergrad and in high school, I learned about two different theories of representatives. So having senators and congressmen who make their decisions, base their decisions based on what their state would want and their locality would want, and also senators or representatives who would make decisions based on their own self-interest or party lines. And it seems like where we're at right now is that senators are not necessarily making decisions based off of what their constituents in that state are saying. And it kind of, with the Kavanaugh thing, it seemed like it was very party lines. The loyalty was on which party they were affiliated with and not necessarily what their states were saying. And when you had senators that were on the fence, it was because of they were worried about what their constituents were saying. So can you guys speak to kind of that divide and whether you think representatives should be representative of their state or whether they should be representative of their party or their own self-interest or beliefs?
My wife's from Maine, and in thinking about, for example, Senator Collins' vote on the Kavanaugh nomination, because you have this phenomenon of conflict extension, so the fact that our identities are defined by our political party, not just among us, but also among our leaders, the stakes are much bigger for a senator who wants to defect. Now, Senator Murkowski defected. Senator Collins didn't because her party caucus could make life very difficult for her, and she made a calculation, probably, that instead of running for governor, that she wants to have a successful time in the Senate and wants to be reelected with the same supporters from her side of things, or even more supporters from her side of things. The Senate's not the best choice for it, because I think if you look overall, most senators were voting in line with the polls at the time. And in fact, as we saw after the Kavanaugh hearings, the polls around the Senate, each side, all the incumbents were rewarded. In that the Senate is much less likely to be in play now because of that. So maybe again another story that in terms of addressing those, what really is a perfect storm of cognitive and partisan issues in the Kavanaugh confirmation, that we're not going to find the answers to that in Washington, D.C.
Go ahead.
I like what you said about teaching law students in different subjects. And I think one thing that you could add to that is teaching about cross-cultural communication in different cultures, because we have a lot of people from here recently from different countries that need to be understood. And I think lawyers need to, if they're representing somebody from, say, somewhere in Africa, they need to know what that person thinks about the laws and how the laws in that person's country work as opposed to how they work in this country, so that they can explain it to them and help them through that process.
In fact, one of the shared outcomes that our faculty has agreed upon is to instill in our students or talk to our students and hope that they acquire the value of cross-cultural competence and the ability to communicate not just as lawyers, but as people. It's essential to their effective representation of clients and necessary both in these days and before as well. And I think that's something that may be unique among law schools across the country, but I think it's something that here is particularly valued, and largely because, in addition, this law school has made a commitment to ensuring our students have practical experience through our clinical programs and otherwise, so they get the opportunity to engage in those practices before they graduate. So yeah, absolutely something that we need to focus on.
You're able to go.
Who's in charge? Tobin.
Back there.
Something that I've noticed for a long time now is that some of our most intelligent citizens have lost their freedom of speech, and they are our professors. In a sense, you don't hear a lot of civic discourse in the public sphere for fear that they'll be fired. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I've noticed somewhat of a silencing. And if you agree or disagree, what do you think the effects, specifically ramifications, have come about on our civic discourse because there is so much fear of reprisal?
I think I would say something and then I'll hand the microphone over to Tobin because I know he has more experience with this phenomenon of silencing or sort of publicly attacking that you're talking about. On this campus, the vast majority of your faculty are unionized, and so we have the protections of a collective bargaining agreement that makes sure that we will not be fired for voicing our political opinions, and that's not the case at a lot of universities across the country. So we're somewhat unique here, and I would argue in that sense that doesn't happen on this campus, but Tobin, I think, will maybe give you a counter perspective.
Well, I mean, I had to, Daisy's referring to the personal experience I had to be putting on a professor watch list a number of years ago. And I mean, coming out of that time, you know, there were things that were unsavory about it, the death threats and other attention that went my way, which wasn't as much fun. But the overwhelming experience for me was that this university and the academy at large stood behind every member who was put on that list and continues to do so today. So the longest durée of that story for me is actually an affirmation of my ability to speak my mind. Now, I've spoken in many other settings about how there are limits on what that means for me as a professor. I just talked about with my students in class today, Jolie's here, Tahid's in the back, where I told them that I don't introduce a lot of contemporary discussion about the historical themes we are addressing because I'm very conscious of my power as a professor to sway people's opinions in the classroom. So I don't put my partisan positions into the classroom. Professors' watch list said I did, but they had no evidence to wrap around to the previous conversation. So I'm not as concerned about it as you are, particularly in terms of the professoriate. I appreciate you looking out for us, but my own experience suggests that we have some robust institutions and traditions that will stand behind academic freedom and has done so consistently in many, many forums.
Can I jump in just as a follow-up? I wonder about your sense of civic discourse in the classroom among your students, particularly for everybody, particularly talking about these challenging issues and whether you've had success in engaging, as you talked about, sort of that deeper conversation.
I mean, I'll just say absolutely. I've been amazed by my students continually over the last number of years of their willingness to be both vulnerable and direct with each other without personally attacking each other. We've seen very little examples of that sort of ad hominem attacks. And that's been, again, one of those reasons I return to that deep-seated hope because I see it in my students on a weekly basis.
I'll just jump in too. Of course, what's the two topics you know that aren't polite in society: politics and religion. And I teach politics, right? So, of course, students are going to come in with political ideas and definite outlooks and opinions about things. And I can affirm also what Tobin's saying as well. It's remarkable and it's hopeful listening to students, again, exchanging ideas and different points of views and disagreeing with each other vigorously, but still being very civil. And still walking out of that classroom, continue to talk to each other. I just feel that's one of the great victories, right? Is then they're still continuing that conversation as they leave the classroom together. But that's the bit of hope again, and it's amazing.
Can we maybe get a new voice in the room? Go ahead in the back. Yeah.
Not the best at this, so I wrote it down. While it's clear to me how focusing on the shared individual concerns of citizens at the local level is able to create a sense of community and shared concern within that locality, it's a little more unclear to me how to universalize these local concerns at the national level when larger amounts of money come into play and are able to influence our political process and therefore collective concerns as a nation.
Well, Monty's already given some examples. I think Standing Rock is an example of making local, global, and international and building solidarity, kind of jumping over or around maybe a recalcitrant national government. Climate change, for example, is a where is that action happening now? It's happening at the local and state levels, in league with the international level. So you have the spectacle of California, which is as big as most countries, engaging in those policy things. And the reason isn't surprising, where we have a federal government where the federal government is failing. We have other spaces in our world where people can seek truth and act on it. So it doesn't stop at the local level. There can be solidarity, but if you're going to build that, it's often still challenging. If we think about cultural competency, that should include ideological competency in our ability to talk to, for a Democrat to talk to, say, a Republican, or a Republican to talk to, say, a Democrat. But it might be easier there than jumping right into the fray in Washington, D.C., and you might even get to international or global concerns that way.
You think, Anthony, about one more question?
Yeah.
Maybe someone from this side of the room. We haven't gotten as many questions. Go ahead, Julia.
I wonder if you could speak to the viability of, I know you guys kind of talked about two parties, Republican and Democrat, but there has been a huge surge of democratic socialism, especially within the younger population. And if you look at the voting map of young millennials that are voting more democratic socialist, it's pretty astounding. And there's a pretty big divide between baby boomers and younger generations like millennials, and I'm curious if you can kind of speak to how that changes with the shift of the Democratic Party, and if there are, what that looks like in the future as far as kind of the shift of, okay, we've got two parties, but how can we change, and is there much shift in that?
Yes, I think there is, and it is, as you point out, generational. There are more millennials that are going further left. There's also, since there's been campus shootings and high school shootings, that has also galvanized a lot of younger now people. I think it still remains to be seen in the next election as to whether they'll vote. They'll just come out and vote. And unfortunately, it dropped off after the Obama election. We had a drop off. So a lot of political scientists indeed are looking at this now. Is this something that really is going to create a kind of pushing of the Democratic Party more to the left? I know Bernie Sanders did, got people some excited, but it's a midterm now. We don't have any Bernie Sanders, so we'll have to see.
I'll just add a personal anecdote. My two sons live in Chicago. They're grads of the U here. They're heavily invested in the DSA and are constantly pointing out my staid, backward, and apparently much more conservative politics than I thought I had. So I'll just, Sam, and Daisy does that all the time as well. But just to affirm the fact that that's an emerging reality, and I think it's really interesting, and we have to pay attention to it. Yeah.
And not if I have a follow-up question, I feel like there's also, it's kind of contingent on this changing job market and this kind of gig economy, and this generation is struggling with having full-time job with benefits in the same way that our parents' generation did. And I think that also kind of comes into question. So when it comes to the conversation about these things and the shift in generation, it's harder. There's more of a gap there because it's such a different playing field. It's a struggle.
Yeah, it's not clear that the primaries, the returns this year, that actually the establishment mainstream Democrats tend to have done at least as well, if not better, than the ones closer to the Democratic Socialist end. But the other thing worth noting is that there's also a stream in the Republican Party of new entrepreneurs and younger people. So we're seeing that change probably on both sides. Maybe a good, we'll keep the conversation going. I'll certainly stay up here and we can continue the conversation. Maybe a good note to end on is prove us eggheads wrong and maybe vote in a midterm, eh? Thank you, everyone.